Chapter 1 of Haste and Waste, The Young Pilot of Lake Champlain, by Oliver Optic. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. The Squall on the Lake. "Stand by, Captain John!" shouted Lawry Wilford, a stout boy of 14, as he stood at the helm of a sloop, which was going before the wind of Lake Champlain. "What's the matter, Lawry?" demanded the captain, who was taking his midday meal with his crew and one passenger in the little cabin. "We're going to have a squall," continued the young pilot, as he glanced at the tall peaks of the Adirondacks, the more northerly of which were entirely enveloped by a dense mass of angry black clouds. There was a squall in those clouds, in the judgment of Lawry Wilford. But having duly notified the captain of the impending danger to his craft, he did not assume any further responsibility in the management of the sloop. It was very quiet on the lake, the water was smooth, and the tiny waves sparkled in the bright sunshine. There was no roll of distant thunder to admonish the voyagers, and the youth at the helm was so much accustomed to squalls and tempests, which are of frequent occurrences on the lake, that they had no terrors to him. It was dinner time, and the young pilot, fearful that the unexpected guest might reduce the rations to a low ebb for the second table, was more concerned about this matter than about the squall. Captain John, as he was familiarly called on board the Missisque, which was the name of the sloop, was not a man to be cheated out of any portion of his dinner by the approach of a squall, and though his jaws may have moved more rapidly after the announcement of the young pilot, he did not neglect even the green apple pies, the first of the season, prepared with care and skill by Mrs. Captain John, who resided on board, and did doctor's duty at the galley. Captain John did not abate a single mouthful of the meal, though he knew how rapidly the mountain showers and squalls travel over the lake. The sloop did not usually make more than 4 or 5 miles an hour, being deeply laden with lumber, which was piled up so high on the deck that the mainsail had to be reefed to make room for it, and eating and sleeping were the only luxuries within the reach of the skipper. The passenger, Mr. Randall, was a director of a country bank, journeying to Shoreham, about 20 miles above the point where he had embarked in the Missisque. He had crossed the lake in the ferry, intending to take the steamer at Westport for his destination. Being a man who was always in a hurry, but never in season, he had reached the steamboat landing just in time to see the boat moving off. Procuring a wherry and a boy to row it, he had boarded the Missisque as she passed up the lake, and though the sloop was not a passenger boat, Captain John, as a special favor to the man of money, had consented to land him at Shoreham. Mr. Randall was a landsman, and had a proper respect for squalls and tempests, even on a freshwater lake. He heard the announcement of Lawry Wilford with a feeling of dread and apprehension, and straightway began to conjure up visions of a terrible shipwreck, and of sole survivors clinging with the madness of desperation to broken spars in the midst of the storm-tossed waters. But Mr. Randall was a director of a country bank, and a certain amount of dignity was expected and required of him. His official position before the people of Vermont demanded that he should not give way to idle fears. If Captain John, who was not a bank director, could keep cool, it was Mr. Randall's solemn duty to remain unmoved, or at least to appear to remain so. The passenger finished the first course of the dinner, which Mrs. Captain John had made a little more elaborate than usual, in honor of the distinguished guest. But he complained of the smallness of his appetite, and it was evident that he did not enjoy the meal after the brief colloquy between the skipper and the pilot. He was nervous. His dignity was a bore to him, and was maintained at an immense sacrifice of personal ease. But he persevered until a piece of the dainty green apple pie was placed before him, when he lacerated the tender feelings of Mrs. Captain John by abruptly leaving the table and rushing on deck. The hurried movement was hardly to be regarded as a sacrifice of his dignity, for it was made with what even the skipper's lady was compelled to allow was a reasonable excuse. In spite of the demand for the proprieties of civilized society, rigorously expected from directors of country banks, who expect in due time to go to Congress, or be governors of the state, Mr. Randall sat at the hospitable board of the skipper of the Missisque in his shirt sleeves, a breach of etiquette for which there was no apology, but the fact that his host appeared at the head of the table in the same undignified costume. "Gracious!" exclaimed Mr. Randall, as the tempting piece of green apple pie, reeking with indigenous juices, was placed before him. At the same moment the bank director further indicated his astonishment and horror by slapping both hands upon his breast in a style worthy of Brutus when Rome was in peril. "What's the matter, squire?" demanded Captain John, dropping his knife and fork and suspending the operation of his vigorous jaws till an explanation could be obtained. "I've left my coat on deck," replied Mr. Randall, rising from his chair. "It's just as safe there as 'twould be on your back, squire," added the skipper. "There's $6,000 in the pocket of that coat," said the bank director, with a gasp of apprehension, partly for the safety of the money, and partly for the safety of his person in the approaching squall. Mr. Randall did not wait to hear any more. He vaulted up the companion ladder like a circus tumbler. "Where's my coat?" demanded he. "There it is," replied Lawry Wilford, pointing to the garment under the rail. "We had a flaw of wind just now, and it came pretty near being blowed overboard." "Gracious!" exclaimed Mr. Randall, as he clutched the coat. "I'm too careless to live. There's $6,000 in a pocket of that coat." $6,000! ejaculated Lawry, whose ideas of such a sum of money were very indefinite. "I should say you ought not to let it lie around loose in this way." "I'm very careless, but the money is safe," continued the director, with a long sigh of relief, as he placed his hand on the treasure. "Stand by, Captain John!" suddenly shouted Lawry, with tremendous energy, as he put the helm down, and rushed forward, almost upsetting the happy Mr. Randall in his passage. The squall was coming up the lake in the track of the Missisque. A dull, roaring sound was heard astern, and all the mountain peaks had disappeared, closed in by the dense volume of black clouds. The episode of the bank director's coat had distracted the attention of the young pilot for a moment, and he had not observed the rapid swoop of the squall as it bore down upon the sloop. He leaped over the piles of lumber to the forecastle, and had cast loose the peak halyard when Captain John tumbled up the companionway in time to see that he had lingered too long over the green apple pie, and that one piece would have been better for his vessel if not for him. "Let go the throat halyard!" roared he. "Down with the mainsail! Down with the mainsail!" Lawry did not need any prompting to do his duty, but before he could let go the throat halyard the squall was upon the sloop. Mr. Randall had seized hold of the rail and was crouching beneath the bulwark, expecting to go to the bottom of the lake, for he was too much excited to make a comparison of the specific gravities of pine boards and fresh water, and therefore did not realize that lumber would float and not sink. The squall did its work in an instant, and before the bank director had fairly begun to tremble, the rotten mainsail of the Missisque was blown into ribbons, and the flapping flitters were streaming in the air. Piece after piece was detached from the bolt rope, and disappeared in the heavy atmosphere. The sloop, in obedience to her helm, came about, and was now headed down the lake. The rain began to fall in torrents, and Mr. Randall was as uncomfortable as the director of a country bank could be. "Go below, sir!" shouted Captain John to the unhappy man. "Is it safe?" asked Mr. Randall. "Safe enough." "Won't she sink?" "Sink? No, she can't sink," replied the skipper. "The wasn't onst over now." Mr. Randall, encouraged by this candid statement of the situation, consented to go below, just as his dignified skin began to feel the cold moisture from the mountain clouds. Mrs. Captain John gave him a seat at her cooking stove, and the chances were all in his favor, in spite of his gloomy forebodings. The fury of the squall was spent in a moment, and then the